It all started innocently enough. I moved to this small, picturesque town in the middle of nowhere to get away from the noise and chaos of the city. I needed a change, a fresh start after the breakup, and the job that was slowly killing me. The townsfolk were friendly, always smiling and offering a helping hand. There was an unusual warmth to their hospitality, but I figured it was just small-town charm. I first heard about the Light of Zion from my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, a kindly old woman with a penchant for baking the most delicious pies. She invited me to one of their gatherings, promising it would be a spiritual experience unlike any other. I had always been a skeptic, but loneliness and curiosity got the better of me. I accepted her invitation. The gathering was held at an old, abandoned church on the outskirts of town. The church looked like it had seen better days, but there was an eerie beauty to it, especially in the twilight. As I stepped inside, I was greeted by the soft glow of candles and the faint scent of incense. The atmosphere was serene, almost hypnotic. I took a seat at the back, trying to blend in. The congregation, a mix of young and old, all seemed deeply engrossed in the sermon delivered by a tall, charismatic man named Father Gabriel. He spoke with such conviction, his voice resonating through the dimly lit hall. His words were a mix of scripture and something else, something that felt ancient and powerful. As the weeks went by, I found myself drawn to the Light of Zion. I attended every gathering, listened intently to Father Gabriel's sermons, and even started to participate in the rituals. They were strange, but not overtly alarming. Just a bit of chanting, some symbolic gestures, and the sharing of bread and wine. There was a sense of belonging, a community that I had been desperately craving. But then, things started to change. Subtly at first. The sermons grew darker, the rituals more intense. Father Gabriel began to speak of a great cleansing, a purging of the sinful and the wicked. He talked about a prophecy, a day of reckoning that was fast approaching. The congregation, myself included, hung on his every word, our faith in him unshakable. One night, after a particularly unsettling sermon, Mrs. Thompson invited me to a special gathering. It was an honor, she said, reserved for the most devoted members. Flattered and intrigued, I accepted. The gathering was held in the basement of the church, a place I had never been before. The air was thick with incense, and the walls were adorned with strange symbols I couldn't decipher. There were about a dozen of us, standing in a circle around an altar. On it lay a book bound in what looked like ancient leather. Father Gabriel entered, his presence commanding and unsettling. He opened the book and began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. The air grew colder, the candle flames flickering wildly. Then he brought out a knife. It was ornate, with a gleaming blade that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He spoke of sacrifice, of offering blood to ensure our salvation. The room fell silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what he meant. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her eyes filled with a disturbing fervor. She bared her arm, and without hesitation, Father Gabriel made a shallow cut. Blood welled up, and she let it drip onto the altar. One by one, the others followed, each offering their blood willingly. When it was my turn, I hesitated. A part of me screamed to run, but another part, the part that had been slowly indoctrinated, urged me to comply. The blade was cold against my skin, the cut quick and precise. My blood mingled with the others, a sacrificial offering to a deity I didn't understand. Father Gabriel's eyes glowed with satisfaction as he completed the ritual, his voice rising in a final chant that echoed through the chamber. In the following days, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The warmth and camaraderie of the town now felt suffocating, their smiles hiding something sinister. I began to notice things I hadn't before, the way the townsfolk would gather in small groups, whispering and glancing around nervously, the strange symbols that started to appear on doors and walls. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to explore the church basement on my own. Armed with a flashlight, I crept through the darkened halls, the silence oppressive. I found the altar, still stained with our blood, and the book Father Gabriel had used. As I flipped through its pages, I realized it was filled with dark incantations and rituals, things that spoke of summoning and binding, of life and death. My blood ran cold as I understood the true nature of the Light of Zion. They weren't worshipping a benevolent deity, but something far darker, something that required blood and sacrifice. I needed to leave, to get away before it was too late. But as I turned to go, I heard footsteps behind me. Father Gabriel stood in the doorway, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice calm but threatening. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped. "They're watching you," he continued, stepping closer. "You've seen too much, and now you must make a choice. Join us fully, embrace the darkness, or face the consequences." I knew what he meant. There was no escaping this place, not without help. Summoning every ounce of courage, I lunged past him, my flashlight swinging wildly. I heard him shout, but I didn't look back. I ran through the darkened corridors, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst out of the church, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't stop running until I reached my house, slamming the door shut and locking it. My mind raced, trying to process everything. I had to get out of this town, away from these people and their dark god. The next morning, I packed my things and left without looking back. As I drove away, I couldn't help but feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. The light of Zion is real, and they are always watching. I first heard about the Ordo Veritatis from my college friend Lisa. She was always into fringe ideas and alternative spiritualities, but when she spoke about this group, there was a different kind of intensity in her eyes. "They really understand the deeper truths," she insisted, her voice hushed yet fervent. I didn't take it too seriously at first. I figured it was just another one of her phases. One rainy Friday evening, she convinced me to come along to one of their gatherings. "Just come once," she pleaded. "You need to see for yourself." Reluctantly, I agreed, if only to get her off my back. We drove for nearly an hour into the countryside, far away from the city lights, until we reached an old, decrepit mansion. The place looked like it had been plucked straight out of a Victorian horror story. Its windows were dark, and the air around it seemed unnaturally still. A shiver ran down my spine as we approached. Inside, the atmosphere was even more unsettling. The main hall was dimly lit by candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls adorned with strange esoteric symbols. About 24 people were gathered, all dressed in black robes, their faces obscured by hoods. They stood in a circle, chanting in a low, rhythmic hum that reverberated through the room. At the center of the circle stood a man I later learned was called the Magister. Tall and imposing, with piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through you, he radiated an unsettling charisma. He welcomed us warmly, his voice smooth and hypnotic, and gestured for us to join the circle. Reluctantly, I took my place beside Lisa, who squeezed my hand reassuringly. The Magister began to speak, his words a mixture of religious scripture and cryptic philosophy. He talked about the awakening of the inner self, the unmasking of the soul, and the pursuit of absolute truth. As he spoke, I felt a strange pull, as if his words were wrapping themselves around my mind, drawing me in. The ceremony that night was relatively tame chanting, a bit of incense, and some cryptic verses recited from an ancient-looking book. Still, there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that made my skin crawl. I left that night with an uneasy feeling, but Lisa seemed more convinced than ever. Over the next few weeks, she attended more and more gatherings, each time coming back with a look of eerie serenity. She tried to convince me to join again, but I resisted. Something about that place felt wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. One night, Lisa called me in a panic. Her voice was shaky, her words barely coherent. "You have to come. It's an emergency. Please, just come." I could hear the fear in her voice, and despite my misgivings, I drove back to the mansion. The atmosphere was even more oppressive this time. The air felt thick, almost tangible, and the candlelight seemed dimmer, casting longer, more sinister shadows. The usual group was there, but something was off. They stood in a tighter circle, their chanting more urgent, more desperate. I found Lisa at the edge of the room, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "They're going too far," she whispered. "The Magister, he wants to summon something." Before I could react, the Magister's voice boomed through the hall, calling for silence. He looked at me, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Ah, we have a new witness to our ascension. Welcome." He gestured for me to join the circle, but I shook my head, taking a step back. "I'm not here for this. I'm here for Lisa." "Lisa is part of us now," he said calmly, "and so shall you be." He raised his hands and the chanting resumed, louder and more intense. The air crackled with a palpable energy, and the room seemed to darken further. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows, another robed member, but with something unsettlingly familiar about their posture. The hood was pulled back, revealing a face I recognized. My brother, Mark. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he disappeared without a trace. His eyes were vacant, his expression blank. "Mark?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond, didn't even seem to acknowledge me. Instead, he moved to stand beside the Magister, his movements stiff and mechanical. The Magister's smile widened. He has seen the truth. He has embraced the awakening. Panic surged through me. I grabbed Lisa's arm, trying to pull her towards the door. "We need to leave now." She resisted, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "I can't. They'll come after us." "We don't have a choice," I insisted, my voice urgent. "Trust me." With a final desperate tug, I managed to break her free from the circle. We bolted for the door, the chanting rising to a frenzied pitch behind us. As we fled through the darkened halls, I heard the Magister's voice echoing, promising that we could never escape the truth, that the Ordo Veritatis would find us. We made it to my car and sped away, the mansion disappearing into the night behind us. Lisa sobbed quietly, her whole body trembling. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until we reached the safety of my apartment. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Strange symbols started appearing on my doorstep, and I received cryptic messages promising my return to the fold. Lisa stayed with me for a while, but she was never the same. The light in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a constant shadow of fear. We eventually lost touch, both of us too haunted by our experiences to maintain any semblance of normalcy. The Ordo Veritatis had left a permanent mark on us, a dark stain on our souls that no amount of time could erase. Even now, years later, I still see those symbols in my dreams, hear the Magister's voice whispering promises of an unending truth. And sometimes, just before I wake, I see Mark's vacant eyes staring back at me, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. It was the summer of 1998 when I first encountered the Brotherhood of the Eternal Flame. My family had just moved to a small town in rural Tennessee, a place so remote it felt like we had stepped back in time. The townsfolk were polite but distant, their eyes guarded, their smiles tight. My parents chalked it up to small-town eccentricity, but I felt something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. We settled into an old farmhouse at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. School was out for the summer, so I spent my days exploring the forest, trying to escape the oppressive heat. One afternoon, while wandering deeper than usual, I stumbled upon an old, overgrown path. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed it until I reached a clearing with a crumbling stone altar at its center. The altar was covered in strange symbols, worn by time but still discernible. Intrigued, I ran my fingers over the carvings, feeling a strange energy pulsing beneath my skin. A sudden rustle in the bushes made me jump, and I turned to see an old man watching me from the edge of the clearing. He had a long, gray beard and eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "This place is sacred to the Brotherhood." I apologized, explaining that I was new in town and had just been exploring. His expression softened slightly, but there was still a wariness in his eyes. "The Brotherhood of the Eternal Flame protects these woods. It's best you stay away from here for your own safety." With that cryptic warning, he disappeared back into the trees, leaving me alone and unnerved. I hurried home, trying to shake off the strange encounter, but that night I couldn't sleep. The old man's words echoed in my mind, and I kept picturing the symbols on the altar. The next day, I asked my parents if they had ever heard of the Brotherhood of the Eternal Flame. They exchanged uneasy glances before my dad sighed and sat me down. "It's an old group," he said. "They've been around for generations, worshipping some ancient deity. Most people in town just avoid them. That didn't satisfy my curiosity, so I began asking around. Most of the townsfolk were tight-lipped, but eventually, I learned bits and pieces. The Brotherhood was rumored to perform strange rituals in the woods, and some said they could control fire with their minds. There were whispers of sacrifices, of people who had gone missing over the years, but no one could or would give me concrete details. As the weeks went by, I couldn't get the Brotherhood out of my head. One night, driven by a mixture of curiosity and a desire for adventure, I decided to return to the clearing. I waited until my parents were asleep, then slipped out of the house and made my way through the forest, the full moon casting an eerie glow over the path. When I reached the clearing, it was empty and silent, the air thick with tension. I approached the altar, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I brought a flashlight and a notebook, determined to document the symbols and try to decipher their meaning. As I traced the carvings with my fingers, a sudden gust of wind extinguished my flashlight. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled to turn it back on, but the batteries were dead. The darkness pressed in around me, and I felt a presence, like eyes watching me from the shadows. Before I could react, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around to see the old man from before, his eyes blazing in the moonlight. "I warned you," he hissed. "Now you've seen too much." I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. He dragged me towards the altar, and as we neared it, I saw other figures emerging from the trees, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They formed a circle around the altar, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The old man forced me to my knees in front of the altar. One of the hooded figures stepped forward, holding a small, ornate knife. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. I struggled, pleading for them to let me go, but my words were swallowed by their chanting. The figure with the knife raised it high, the blade catching the moonlight, and I knew in that moment that I was about to die. Just as the knife began to descend, a blinding light filled the clearing. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the figures recoiled, shielding their eyes. I felt the old man's grip loosen, and I took my chance, scrambling to my feet and running as fast as I could through the forest. I didn't stop until I reached home, my breath ragged, my body trembling. My parents were waiting for me, their faces pale with worry. I collapsed into their arms, sobbing uncontrollably. We left town the next morning, not even stopping to pack our things. My parents didn't ask for details. They knew something terrible had happened, and that was enough. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest. The memory of that night burned into my mind. Years have passed, but the nightmares haven't faded. I still see the old man's fiery eyes, the hooded figures, the knife descending. The Brotherhood of the Eternal Flame is real, and their dark rituals continue, hidden in the depths of those ancient woods. And somewhere deep inside, I know that they haven't forgotten me.